So I'm here to talk largely about mindfulness, but there's going to be, as I say, some about golden civilization as well. I'm mostly known in the world for my work in the financial field. So I was a financial advisor. I initiated a way of training financial planners in 30 countries, thousands of advisors all over the world in how to inspire, how to catch the inspiration inside of their clients for who they really wanted to be, and then to empower them to live really exceptional lives. This was also for the advisors themselves, and at all levels, from the poorest of the poor in India to quite well-to-do people as well. So this is what I'm known for. What people don't realize is that often when they hear about my work, they don't realize that the work is based on listening. They think it's based on inspiring questions, and those are certainly there. The work is really based on listening. And this is, I think, a link to this last discussion that was just happening. But the link to mindfulness, in a number of my books, I've called mindfulness inner listening. And that's essentially what it is. It's just listening, but it's listening inside ourselves. So what I want to do is just spend 1 or 2 minutes just doing simple mindfulness, what would be normally a 20-minute session. We're going to contract to 1 or 2 minutes, then talk about it in some ways that I think will be, I'm going to ask some pretty powerful questions of you, transformational questions, I hope, in terms of your thinking. But let's start with just a minute or two of mindfulness practice. For those of you who know how to do it, just go right at it. But what I'd like to do is to suggest for everybody to find a posture where you feel comfortable, where your back is relatively erect, your body at ease. I suggest closing your eyes because it limits the input, the sensory input. And a lot of what we're doing is finding our authenticity outside of the analytic, outside of the mind. So close your eyes and at first just feel what it is to be in a body. Appreciate this body that has brought you through these 6 or 7 decades already. Appreciate each of the sensations. And then go to the breath, wherever it is that you find the breath easiest to follow as sensation. For most of us, that's either at the belly, particularly if you're a singer or you're a swimmer, might be more at the belly. And for others of us, it's more likely at the nostrils. And here again, just experience the breath, letting go of whatever thoughts arise, just letting them go and coming back. Martin Buber said the central spiritual act is the act of returning. So all we're doing is letting go, coming back, and returning. Feeling those sensations, ephemeral, impermanent, seemingly insignificant, but somehow telling us something about who we are right now in this moment. Letting go of your thoughts, returning to this experience of just being here. So let's come out of that meditation. I think for those of you who've never done anything like that before, you can feel the quiet. Normally people in it with a meditation practice will do it 20 minutes. And so there's a lot of deepening, and you get very, very quiet. You can get very quiet. And it's hard to do. Even after 50 years of doing it, it's hard to do. But that difficulty that Hank was facing in the a week-long 10-day retreat that I did, that's your cutting edge. Wherever it's difficult, that's where your neurotic structures come in, your attachments come in, and so that's good. One way I think of it is a bad meditation is a good meditation. That's good. That's where you're meant to work. It's very valuable. Just to give you my background really briefly, I've taught mindfulness meditation for 35 years weekly in various parts of the world, had various communities throughout the world. And I've taught week-long meditation retreats, 10 days, as Henry and Sandy came to, probably 100 of them over the last 35 years. They're powerful and really profound, and have the diversity of experience that Henry and Sandy expressed. Very powerful. I've practiced meditation since I learned it at Harvard in a TM class 50 years ago, probably similar to what Kirby learned in many ways. And I've practiced, I'm an explorer here. This is my science. I am passionate about learning about the present moment. So I've practiced meditation in addition to all these other things I've done. Probably I've averaged about 3 hours a day over 50 years. And I'll describe some of what I've gathered from that practice, from that process. It's not just an escape. This is an exploration and a learning and a growing. I'll talk about that as well. There's a trick question I ask audiences, and sometimes I've asked this to an audience as large as 1,000 people. So I'm going to ask it to all of you, and that is, have you ever had an experience of freedom in the past sometime? Walking the beach, doing something wildly creative, being with your kids. How many of you had an experience of freedom in the past? Raise your hand and I'll hold it up there. Hank Greenspan's got his hand up. Peter Heil's got his hand up. Come on, I want everybody's hand up. How many of you had an experience of freedom in the past? Okay, so of course it's a trick question. And the answer is, you all got it wrong. Okay, so because the truth is, and this is one of the extraordinary things about mindfulness, the truth is none of us have ever had an experience of freedom in the past. We have only ever had an experience of freedom in the present moment. That's an extraordinary thing. And it's not reflected in our science. Should be. And I'll describe how I'm beginning to bring that into science in a moment. We've never had an experience of freedom in the past. So we never had an experience, period, in the past. The only moment we've ever known is the present moment. There's an extraordinary study by Daniel Gilbert. Some of you know Daniel Gilbert as being the Harvard professor who has the most popular course at Harvard on happiness. And he did this with Matthew Killingsworth. And it's an extraordinary study where it's called A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind. And it's an extraordinary study because what he does is he demonstrates that happiness and freedom is not, being on the beach in Maui, but has much more to do with our relationship with the present moment. And that people who are happy, that happiness is likely to be because you're here. Right now, you're focused, you're present. You're here in the moment. And if you're in a wandering mind instead, you tend to not be happy. Extraordinary study. So what I wonder, I've written, most of my books have been about freedom in one version or another. So one of the things that I am promoting is that in education, why not at Exeter? Why aren't we studying? Why aren't we teaching the mastery of the present moment and integrating it with every subject that we do, with all the administrative work, with everything? Middlesex is doing it. Lawrence Academy is doing it. Two prep schools in Massachusetts are doing it. I think it's a really powerful question to be asking. One of the ways that I've been exploring the present moment is through poetry and photography and intermingling them. And I'm in the middle of finishing a 25-year piece of work that I've dedicated myself to, that is going to have every single week of the year, so 52 two-page spreads, and 365 every single day of the year, really exploring in poetry and photography the present moment. So it'll be over 800 pages. And I'm just finishing up the first of the 5 books that will be coming out over the next 2 years. So this will give you some idea of how I'm interweaving, and Hank, you'll recognize some influence of Hokusai and Hiroshige in there. The map of mindfulness. So when I was reflecting on this present moment, and everything really, the only moment we ever experienced the present moment, my first book, the only book that I've written that wasn't published, was a book on gravitational physics. It was the first book I wrote. And I've gone back and studied particularly the work of John Archibald Wheeler, who was the great student, the great teacher of Richard Feynman. And so I studied a lot about time and space and about the structures of black holes. You'll notice that this has a bit of a black hole structure. But what I thought here was that if time and space is not where everything happens, if where everything really happens is in the present moment, it should be primary in our map of how we organize our frame of going about our life. And it's not. So I thought, what if I pulled that present moment out of time and space and made it the centerpiece of the map? What would happen then? And it's quite extraordinary what happens. So if you think about what we just did with meditation, what we were doing was taking our mindfulness and applying it to the present moment, that circle at the center of this map. And we kept returning again and again to the present moment. You could tell from Kirby's poetry, he's talking about awakening in a way. And the way we get lost all the time because the present moment is so, impermanence it's so built in, and we keep getting thrown by it. And so we go back to the world and kind of forget where we were exactly. And that's really, really evident when we do meditation, which makes it all the more interesting. How can I be really present? How can I master the present moment if that's where happiness and freedom really reside? And so what we're moving toward is a mirror of awakening as opposed to a mirror of forgetfulness. And then an engagement in the world, which could be passion, could be compassion. So the other thing about this map of mindfulness is that what happens when you do a meditative practice is of any kind. And Kirby does his differently from the way I do mine. Mine has more of a Buddhist basis, and it's largely secular. I think his comes more from the Hindu tradition, but I don't want to speak for him. But I know we've both dabbled and touched deeply all the different traditions. What happens in each of the traditions, because you're coming back to something that's not about you, is that you're actually cultivating selflessness. And so every time you return, that's the reason Martin Buber said, every time you return, that's the central spiritual act. Every time you return to your meditation object, here it's the present moment, it's the breath, you're cultivating selflessness. And as a consequence, you can have incredible experiences of peace, incredible spiritual experiences, religious experiences, experiences of great spirit. The thing that I like, because I'm really interested in civilization right now, is great virtue. So the other resource I want to turn you on to is a wonderful book by Daniel Goleman. Daniel Goleman, who wrote Emotional Intelligence. His most recent book is called Altered Traits. And we've been talking about at various points cultural history of our generation. Altered Traits is a study of all the science of meditation that has accumulated over the last 30 or 40 years. And what it demonstrates is that the more we meditate, the more virtues accumulate, the more we develop virtues inside of ourselves. It's a cultural history at the same time of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Those of us who've been around Cambridge at one point or another during the 60s and 70s, of William James Hall and the movement from psychedelics to psychology and meditation. Really interesting study and of meditation. The virtues, I mean, mindfulness, I mean, it's not just virtues. Mindfulness increases the length of your telomeres, so it increases your longevity. There are all kinds of studies of how it benefits you with health. Studies that talk about it builds patience, it increases your compassion, increases your empathy. Really, really wonderful things, and they increase just automatically because you're building selflessness into your kind of way of being. So the final thing I want to say here before I go to the civilization piece of my talk is that I think the map of the universe is all wrong. This map of time and space without putting the present moment as the center, it's all wrong. It's just not right. The universe is structured around the present moment, which means it's profoundly about presence. It's profoundly about our presence in the world. It's about our relationship to the present moment and to each other. It's profoundly relational, and it's not Cartesian. Which is what time and space is. It's Cartesian and acquisitive. It's not acquisitive. That's not the nature of things. That's not the nature of the present moment. So I'm going to make that bold statement and go to another bold statement about civilization as I lead into this next piece of my talk. And this is again, as I've been wrestling with what's happening in civilization and really impressed again with what Clyde and John were just going through. I've come from the financial services industry, and we were taught, all about markets and how brilliant markets are. And of course, we've learned that markets ended up being markets for the rich guys and markets for large institutions, but not really markets for all of us, which was what Adam Smith's original ideas are. So here's the question. We've had this incredible increase in longevity. Just studies coming out just about the last 100 years, that we've doubled our longevity in the last 100 years. Well, if you go back to London in the 1920s, you'll see that we've tripled our longevity in the last 200 years. It's extraordinary what we've done. Since the beginnings of democracy and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution 250 years ago. Here's my question with all of this. If what we've done is so incredible, how is it that we've had 250 years to work with the hierarchies of power that come out from our institutional structure? We talk a lot about systemic racism now. I think all of our problems are systemic. And it's time for us to address them at a systemic level, and all of them at once. That's one of the big, bold ideas. But the question here is, if our system is really right and is best, how come in those 250 years, we don't automatically find in every hierarchy of power that comes out of this, that at the top of that hierarchy of the power, there's wisdom, the best of humanity. There's wisdom and compassion and kindness. How come the best of humanity is not at the top of every single hierarchy of power? I mean, that's a pretty powerful question, I think. I think it's time that we make that happen. So you'll see in this map, we've got civilization, incredible brains. Where are the hearts at the top of those hierarchies of power? Self-interest, supposed to do everything. What about self-knowledge? What if that was really what drove things, the wisdom? But it's the negative externalities I'd like to focus on mostly, because I don't, if it's all systemic, and I should have racism in here as well, if it's all systemic, then there's something at the base of the way our systems kind of come out that needs to be adjusted, just tweaked. Isn't there a way that we could just tweak that base of how institutions arise and transform all this? So I'm wrestling with those kinds of ideas. How do we make a golden civilization happen now, within this generation? So you can see markets versus democracy, Earth is exploitable, Earth is sustainable. So I've been taking this vision of participative democracy out and initiating community conversations and ongoing conversations, and then groups gathering together from across the world. So first identifying what the vision is of a golden civilization. Let's do it now. What would it look like if it was already here? And what are the obstacles? We all read the obstacles every day in the news, so we know them. But the final thing, and what I really loved about John Lenhart's oak tree, is that the final thing that we do is we go to, what are your commitments? We know the actions, like Malcolm and Clyde were talking about actions, great. And Clyde was again talking about local stuff at the end there. It's down to commitments at the end. What are we committed to? So this conversation goes from inspiring vision to obstacles and then back to commitments. And so it's an incredibly alive conversation. There's one more thing I want to add to this. I've been doing this in groups all over the world. One more thing is just my personal thought on this is that there is a very simple legislative solution, very difficult to get through, but very simple legislative solution. Let me show you what I think it is. It comes from, because in the financial world, there's a lot of controversy around a fiduciary standard, why that exists. And it's just absurd that we should have controversy about it. But here's what would solve, I think, all these institutional problems, coming up with negative, what Clyde called unintended consequences, what the economists call negative externalities. This would solve it. A fiduciary standard of obligation required for all institutions, corporate, nonprofit, and governmental, to place the interests of all stakeholders of humanity, of democracy, and the living planet that sustains us first, above their own self-interest. That would solve it. Simple. Structure a vision to obstacles to what are you going to do about it is extraordinary. And so it's not me talking about what you got to do. I shared my thoughts here, but this is really about participative democracy. And it's a beautiful thing.